Welcome to episode number 6 of Sustaining the Herd, brought to you by Sechi Agri-Services and Engineering. I'm your host, Brock Vitek, joined today by my co-host, Andrew Wadle. We're excited to be back with you today to spend some time exploring innovation and sustainability in the agriculture industry. Before we jump into today's conversation, Andrew and I would like to say a big thank you to all of our listeners, both new and returning, for choosing to spend some time every couple of weeks to join us here on Sustaining the Herd. Today, Andrew and I will dig into what we think is an interesting topic. You've heard us talk quite a bit about anaerobic digestion in the past several episodes, with biogas being the main product of that. Well, today we would like to dig into the many ways that exist to achieve revenue in the biogas industry, and the host of acronyms that those are all called, or what we'd like to call the ABCs of getting paid for biogas. Andrew, can you help us jump into this conversation?
Yeah, thank you, Brock. And so, before we start talking about biogas or what biogas really is, it's a matter of understanding where biogas is coming from. And these days in animal agriculture, biogas is in all likelihood coming from an anaerobic digestion process. And that anaerobic digestion process is where manure is taken from a barn or a feedlot and put into an enclosed vessel and heated. And the bacteria, the natural bacteria in the manure, decomposes the organic matter. And one of the byproducts of the decomposition of the organic matter is biogas. And that biogas just so happens to contain a significant portion of methane. And it just so happens that methane is what we all know in homeowner circumstances or industrial circumstances as natural gas. And so it's pretty remarkable when you think about we can have animal agriculture facilities producing natural gas. And in most cases, and when done right, and it has to be done right, the natural gas or the methane gas produced from manure is no different than the natural gas that would come from your typical sources, your traditional sources of getting natural gas from what I'm making air quotes and saying fossil fuels. So what we're doing is we're offsetting the use of traditional natural gas with gas that's produced from animal manure.
Thanks, Andrew. Yes, and that natural gas produced from these organic sources, such as animal manure, RNG is the acronym we use for that, which stands for Renewable Natural Gas. So that's our first dive into the ABCs of biogas here. And when it comes to selling or marketing renewable natural gas, there are a few different markets it can go into. There are also some factors that come into the pricing of RNG. And one of those is what we call the CI score, which means carbon intensity. So as we think about carbon intensity, this is everything that goes into, it accounts for all of the emissions that go into the production of that renewable natural gas, all the way to getting it delivered to the fuel pump where the semi-truck might fill up on compressed natural gas, or to the tap at your stove or the furnace in your house or the boiler in the factory. So really just the emissions footprint of the entire life cycle of the RNG production. And the more negative or lower that score is, the more negative emissions footprint it has, which means it's the more carbon that it's taking out of the atmosphere, preventing further emissions, the more valuable that RNG is perceived to be, which leads to a higher price. Andrew, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, and so a lot of people look at carbon intensity scoring and they say, how is it possible to have a negative score? And it's just another wonder about agriculture and how everything in agriculture is about recycling and reuse. And so when you produce renewable natural gas from manure, you're doing two things. A, you're producing a fuel source, and you're avoiding or decreasing emissions that would otherwise occur from, say, methane going into the atmosphere from an open manure storage.
Certainly. We're avoiding emissions on the farm, and we're displacing an equivalent volume of fossil fuels. Exactly. So now that we've established how some of this pricing works and determining the quality perhaps of renewable natural gas, we have to look at the different markets that it might be sold into. And we typically break these down into two main markets. One that I would call regulatory and or compliance market, where fuel suppliers are regulated, that they have to monitor and control the emissions footprint or the CI score of the fuels they're selling. And there's also a voluntary market where people, companies, organizations are making voluntary actions to reduce their carbon footprint. Andrew, what could you help us understand about these two markets?
Okay, Brock. Yeah, the way to look at those is when you have the regulatory and voluntary markets. Is regulatory would be what we would call RINs, and so there's another acronym to go into this alphabet soup of compensation for selling biogas. It's RINs, which is Renewable Identification Number. And so what happens is, whenever a unit of fuel by traditional sources is produced or imported, the importer or producer is obligated, they are the obligated party to purchase a renewable identification number to what would be considered more or less offsetting the fuel that is being imported or produced. And so whenever your traditional petroleum companies produce or import fuel, they are obligated to purchase renewable identification numbers. And there's a price or a cost associated with doing that. So that's on the buying side. The obligated parties have to buy renewable identification numbers. But then when you produce renewable natural gas on an animal operation, you generate a renewable identification number, and that is what you are being paid for. The petroleum companies say is purchasing the renewable identification number that is being produced or generated on the animal operation. So RINs, RINS, is one of the ways that producers are being compensated for producing renewable natural gas.
Certainly, and I might add to that as well, Andrew. People may actually be more closely connected to RINs than they realize, because I imagine that most of us, when we go to put some gasoline in our car or our pickup truck, we might be getting super unleaded that has maybe 10% ethanol in it. And the ethanol industry has been played a really big part with RINs and the renewable fuel standard for the last 20 years or so, where ethanol plants sell a lot of RINs that petroleum companies are required to purchase. So we all are involved in that, even if we may not realize it. And moving on from RINs, another major component of the regulatory market is the LCFS. And what does LCFS mean? Well, that is low carbon fuel standard. And the most well-known and most prominent low carbon fuel standard market exists in California, where a lot of population is, and where they're really working to tackle some of these climate issues. So the low carbon fuel standard requires obligated parties, as Andrew described, similarly to RINs, so fuel suppliers within the state of California, to purchase LCFS credits. Think of it as a bit of a state level RIN in the state of California. And what's interesting about this is that, take, for example, a dairy farm in the state of Nebraska that may have an anaerobic digester producing biogas and RNG. Well, physical delivery of the gas is not required in California. So that means the molecule of methane, CH4, produced in Nebraska does not have to physically get to California, as long as that is injected into an interstate pipeline network that is physically connected to California. It's called book and claim accounting, whereby the carbon intensity of what I'd call the common pool of natural gas in that pipeline distribution system is lowered by the injection of the RNG. It's really the principle of displacement. So someone in Nebraska, or even all the way out in New York, for example, could participate in the LCFS market in California by selling these credits to obligated parties there. And this is really based on carbon intensity score. And a couple of years ago, these were going for $200 per LCFS credit. Today, they're under $100. Probably they'll fluctuate between 50 and 75 approximately these days. And just once again, another market that producers are able to take advantage of. And something else that's interesting is that LCFS and RINs are stackable. So an RNG producer, whether that's a municipality with wastewater or food waste, or a farmer that's digesting manure, they are able to sell LCFS credits in California as well as RIN credits through the federal renewable fuel standard. That's not considered double counting. So it's interesting how some of this revenue starts to become stackable.
Yeah, that's right, Brock. And so there are some headwinds, I guess, that we should just kind of alert people to, and that is at the moment, the way things are trending, the price or value of LCFS is decreasing, and a lot of it's because really animal agriculture and other producers of renewable natural gas are doing such a good job that there's actually becoming an overabundance of LCFS credits and not enough buyers. And so, like anything, the price is going to continue to go up and down, and it is very much dependent upon politics in California. So the two primary drivers of revenue on the regulatory side would be the LCFS and the RINs. And then Brock also alluded to the voluntary market. And so this is really interesting, and that is, what do companies like L'Oreal and Shell have in common? And well, one of them is that they both are buying renewable natural gas as a means of offsetting their carbon footprint. And so what the voluntary market amounts to is companies that are big users of petroleum. They will go out and they will buy natural gas, renewable natural gas, paying a premium for it, and they will do that in order to offset, as I said, their carbon intensity and carbon footprint. And so it's just amazing how these companies are really kind of coming out of the woodwork to be purchasing renewable natural gas in the interest of the environment.
Yeah, thanks for that great introduction to the voluntary market, Andrew, and helping us understand who the buyers are and some of the market drivers. And as we dive deeper into that, I'd like to help people understand how it works or how it looks when someone participates in the voluntary market and how that compares to participating in the regulatory or compliance market. So as I imagine everyone has come to understand so far through the course of this conversation, is that the regulatory market, well, yes, it's a regulated market and probably here to stay for a while, is still subject to price volatility. As we know, in the last couple of years, LCFS credits in California have gone down or decreased dramatically. And we know that RIN prices fluctuate as well, even though that they have been trending upward, still nothing guaranteed. Price volatility exists. The voluntary market's a bit different because these large companies like L'Oreal or Shell, or maybe large food companies, Cargill, Tyson, JBS, you name them, these companies will often sign offtake agreements with producers of renewable natural gas. Typically, we'll see like a 10-year fixed price offtake. So, for example, a large company would sign an offtake agreement with a dairy farmer that has a digester for, let's say, $30 per MMBTU, for example. Don't quote me on that price, just a placeholder. For every MMBTU produced for the next 10 years. And there may be an inflation kicker built into that contract where it's maybe a 2 or 3% compounding annual increase on the price. But that RNG producer, that farmer knows that's the price they're going to receive for the next 10 years. While that may limit their upside, let's say LCFS and RINs go sky high, well, we can't participate in that market because we have a fixed offtake. We do know that we've limited our downside and we're fixed at this price. And for all of the farmers and ranchers listening, in some ways, this may seem a bit similar to commodity marketing, whether you're trading cattle, you're trading grain, protecting yourself against downside risk while trying to leave yourself open to the upside. There can be some parallels between these worlds, and both markets have their merits, I would say.
Yeah, and then maybe the best part of it all is that when you are selling renewable natural gas, it is possible to do a combination. You can take a portion of your gas and sell it on the regulatory market. And then you can take another portion of your gas and you can sell it on the voluntary market to do, as Brock said, to kind of hedge against the volatility. And it's important to make the distinction between these two markets of the regulatory and the voluntary, in that, there's no question, as many free market people, present company included, would say, what's all this business about the government being involved in mandating companies buy renewable identification numbers, et cetera. Well, that is true. And however, the voluntary piece is that it is voluntary. It is the free market saying that this is what the free market is willing to pay, because then they know, quite possibly, then some of that, there's no question that some of that cost, that increased cost, will pass on to the consumer. But the fact of the matter is, the voluntary market is just that. It is voluntary. So I won't say maybe something necessary to feel good about, but it is something just to kind of come some sense of satisfaction that it is the market kind of doing its thing.
Yeah, it certainly is, Andrew. And maybe this isn't a fair comparison, but sometimes I like to think of the voluntary market as the Wild West in some ways, because there are some really interesting offtake agreements you'll hear about out there, and companies that are doing some things that you haven't heard about before. And just as you said, I think it really is the market driving what's happening. It is some consumers who are demanding greater transparency for sustainability. Just as we talked about on the last episode with David Crass, we had a great discussion about how consumers are in the driver's seat in a lot of this. And I think investors are also in the driver's seat, the shareholders of these large companies that are entering these offtake agreements and purchasing renewable gas. It truly is voluntary in all ways.
Absolutely.
Definitely. Thanks for that insight, Andrew. That's something that really matters, something we really need to think about with these projects and with the marketing of gas. It's not free to produce by any means. It's a multi-million-dollar effort. And related to that, I'd like to jump into tax credits now. And I think this might be just as much the Wild West as some of the voluntary market happenings these days. A big one that a lot of people in the renewable energy industry have been talking about for around a year now is the investment tax credit. I imagine a lot of us are familiar with the IRA, and not a retirement account IRA, but the Inflation Reduction Act that had a lot of widespread implications for our United States economy. Well, one provision in the IRA is the 30% ITC, 30% investment tax credit, which means that 30% of the capital investment, so essentially the cost to design and build a renewable energy facility, of course with some disclaimers and certain eligibility and qualifications, most of a biogas project does qualify, is eligible for this 30% tax credit. So that means, for example, if I were to go out and build a $100 million anaerobic digester system, I would get $30 million back in a tax credit. That really moves the needle on these projects, and that can make or break a project on whether or not it'll be profitable and viable. So that's something that has really attracted a lot of people to the biogas industry in the past months, up to a past year. And it also makes some projects possible that may not have been economically feasible before. Andrew, any comments on that?
Yeah, that's correct. And these are things that are being done. And I think they are things that, as we've said before on our podcast, that agriculture is just the greatest recycling system, the planet knows. Where we're producing the biogas, we're offsetting fossil fuels, and we are then sequestering carbon dioxide as well.
It certainly is. And I think something else for everyone to think about is that, well, you could argue that it's a subsidy in some ways. It's a bit different than a production subsidy. It's not like this tax credit is on every unit of gas produced. Now, there are some production credits out there for renewable electricity and other things, and that's a different conversation. But this can help to get that CapEx, that capital expenditure barrier down to build a project that can then operate profitably on its own once the facility is built. So I think this really lowers the barrier to entry in many ways for profitable projects to have success out in the market. And then another tax credit, maybe a bit more in the Wild West, is the 45Q carbon sequestration credit. And this strays a bit from what we've talked about with biogas, because it's all about carbon dioxide, not so much biogas. Let's take a minute to talk about this one. This is really big in the ethanol industry right now, where we know that ethanol plants produce a fair amount of carbon dioxide that's going up out of the flue, out of the chimney, and into the air. And they're able to monetize that by pumping that into an underground pipeline that might take that carbon dioxide maybe just down the road, depending where they are, or maybe hundreds of miles across the region here in the Midwest to an injection well where that carbon dioxide is pumped underground and, I use air quotes, kind of like Andrew did earlier, and permanently sequestered in cavities in the ground. Maybe these are old natural gas cavities or salt mines, you name it, just underground cavities where this gas can be injected at a supercritical level, very high PSI, stored underground. And this can be monetized through the 45Q credit, which was another revision of the Inflation Reduction Act. It existed before, but the Inflation Reduction Act really made it more attractive. And this isn't just pennies we're talking about. It can be, last I checked, and it could be different now, it was up to around, I think, if you met all of the provisions and requirements, up to $85 per metric ton equivalent of CO2 sequestered. And this, as we think about that CO2 getting sequestered, that also lowers the CI score, the carbon intensity of your renewable fuel. Ethanol in the case I'm talking about, or let's think about biogas. As Andrew said, biogas produced at an anaerobic digester, or maybe even from a landfill, whether it's manure or food waste in a digester, it's around 50%, 60% methane, then we have 20 to 30% CO2. Well, we run that gas through the cleanup system, that CO2 could just be put out into the air, or it could be sequestered. Maybe it goes straight to a pipeline, or if the volume's not big enough, it could go into a pressurized tanker trailer and be hauled to an injection point to participate in this 45Q carbon sequestration market, which then turns into another revenue stream for a biogas project, and also lowers our CI score because we are no longer preventing the emissions of that CO2 into the air. And then all of a sudden we're able to maybe sell our gas for a little bit more because of that even more negative CI score. And I'm making a lot of assumptions, and there are certainly some disclaimers that need to go along with this, but the opportunities really are far and wide for revenue in biogas. And there are some tax credits that are unlocking some really interesting opportunities lately.
All right, Brock. So let's just do a recap on the ABCs, or the alphabet soup of anaerobic digester revenue streams. Right? We've got the voluntary markets, and we have the regulatory markets. And the regulatory markets, the ABCs would be, you have the LCFS, which is the California Low Carbon Fuel Standards. And then you also have the RINs, which is the Renewable Identification Number, which is what the petroleum producers need to be purchasing, which then we also produce when we're producing biogas. And then we also have the voluntary market, which isn't necessarily a part of the ABCs, but I think you guys get the point that it's something where companies voluntarily go out and they buy these credits, or buy this gas, this renewable natural gas. And then also on the voluntary side, the free market side, is we have the investment tax credits, the ITC. And that is certainly an appealing enticement these days to get projects funded. And then of course, last but certainly not least, that Brock alluded to is the 45Q tax credits for doing things such as carbon dioxide sequestration. Hopefully that captures it all.
Thanks, Andrew. That sums it up well. Thank you all once again for joining us today, both new and returning listeners. We're very grateful for you choosing to spend some time with us. We look forward to being back with another episode in another couple of weeks. Until then, thanks for joining the herd today.